Hello everyone. Tonight, we step into a realm of strange mysteries, where stories that seem ordinary at first glance suddenly twist into unexpected tragedy. So, before you settle in and get comfortable, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the mysterious. And don't forget to leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. It's always fascinating to see how we connect from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, let the atmosphere grow still, and together let's embark on tonight's journey into the unknown. Number 1. The Peshtigo Fire. On the evening of October 8, 1871, residents of the small Wisconsin town of Peshtigo noticed a red glow rising on the horizon, with ash and cinders drifting in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a forest fire was burning, perhaps a large one. The townspeople, accustomed to such events, began preparing to defend their homes. They filled barrels with water and primed their pumps, ready to act. But none of their efforts would matter in the end. Peshtigo was about to face the deadliest forest fire in American history. In 1870, Peshtigo was a prosperous community nestled in the dense forests of northeastern Wisconsin. Built along the Peshtigo River, it was one of the region's largest and fastest-growing settlements. The town was home to nearly 2,000 people, a school, 2 churches, and several factories. The surrounding forests were vital to its economy. 2-mile logs were floated downriver to the local sawmill, where they were cut into lumber. One woodworking plant produced everything from chairs to clothespins, while another specialized in doors, windows, and shutters. Because lumber was so plentiful and easy to obtain, it was used for nearly everything. Almost every building in Peshtigo was made of wood and connected by wooden boardwalks. Furniture, fences, bridges, even bedding, contained wood in some form. People stuffed mattresses with wood shavings and scattered sawdust over muddy roads to soak up the moisture. Small fires were a common sight. At the time, loggers burned piles of leftover branches and stumps, while farmers routinely set their fields alight to clear brush. Occasionally, these fires would spread, filling the air with smoke and ash so thick that schools closed and townsfolk carried lanterns in the middle of the day. All of it was accepted as part of life in Peshtigo, TRS, a nuisance, but nothing out of the ordinary. That is why, when the sky turned red on the night of October 8th, few were alarmed. But as the crimson glow grew brighter and flakes of ash began to drift down over the town, unease set in. A group of men hauled out their water pumps and prepared to draw from the river. Barrels had already been stationed throughout town as a precaution, but within moments, a deep roar was heard. Then, suddenly, fire erupted from the forest's edge and swept into Peshtigo. Witnesses later said the flames moved faster than a speeding locomotive, sending waves of embers and burning debris ahead of them, consuming everything that could burn. Houses, barns, clothing, even human hair ignited in an instant. The men operating the pumps realized the hopelessness of their task and fled. Everyone who could still run did the same, sprinting through the smoke toward the river. One survivor, Father Peter Pernin, later wrote, "The air became unbreathable, filled with sand, dust, ashes, cinders, smoke, and fire. It was almost impossible to see, to open one's eyes, or to recognize anyone, though the road was packed with people and wagons colliding in panic. Some ran toward the river, others in the opposite direction, all caught in the vortex of the firestorm. Thousands of frightful sounds echoed together: the neighing of horses, the crash of chimneys, the uprooting of trees, the roaring of the wind, and the crackling of flames leaping from house to house. Every noise imaginable, except the sound of human voices. All were struck, dumb by terror. Many never made it to the river, their clothes and hair ablaze. They collapsed in the streets. Those who reached the water plunged in, praying it would protect them. It did not. Father Pernin continued, "When the water rose to my neck, I thought myself safe from the fire, but it was not so. The flames rolled across the surface as they did on land. The air itself was on fire. Our heads were constantly in danger. Only by dousing ourselves and splashing water upon our faces could we keep the flames at bay. Blankets and clothing thrown into the river floated past us. I seized a few and draped them over those clinging to me, but they dried within moments in the furnace-like heat and ignited again whenever we stopped throwing water upon them. As the hours passed, many perished, burned, exhausted or frozen in the cold river water. Nearly 6 hours after it began, the fire finally subsided enough for survivors to climb ashore. What awaited them was a vision of utter ruin. Peshtigo had been erased. Nothing remained untouched by flame or smoke. More than a dozen nearby communities had also been completely destroyed. People who had sought refuge in plowed fields, wells, or ponds sometimes survived by sheer luck, but others suffocated when the inferno consumed the very oxygen around them. The fire had flattened forests and melted metal. In places, the sand itself fused into glass. Both wild and domestic animals were wiped out. Every source of food was gone, every shelter reduced to ash. Some survivors found themselves stripped naked, their clothes burned from their bodies. Telegraph lines were destroyed, cutting off communication and leaving Peshtigo and the surrounding region isolated. News of the disaster spread only as fast as survivors could carry it. The first relief came from nearby towns spared by chance. Food and clothing arrived from Marinette, and later, as word spread, aid poured in from across the state. By grim coincidence, the Peshtigo fire occurred on the very same night as the Great Chicago Fire. When officials realized that the death toll in Peshtigo far exceeded that of Chicago, trains loaded with relief supplies were redirected north. In total, the inferno claimed roughly 1,700 lives, though the exact number will never be known, since the town's records burned along with everything else. Hundreds more were left injured by fire or smoke. It would take years to understand what made the Peshtigo blaze so catastrophic. Most forest fires burned themselves out or spread slowly. So what caused this one to explode with such fury? The answer lay partly in the weather. The previous year had been exceptionally dry, leaving the land tinder-ready. Strong winds on the day of the fire fed the flames, carrying embers for miles. When the fire reached a certain intensity, it created its own weather, a firestorm. As the heat rose, it sucked in surrounding air, generating tornado-like winds that survivors later compared to a hurricane. These winds drove the flames faster than any human could run. The spark that started it all was never identified. It may have been a campfire, a spark from a rifle, a lightning strike, a farmer burning brush, or railroad workers laying track. But in truth, the source hardly mattered. Under those conditions, any flame could have grown into an unstoppable storm of fire. At the time, there was little anyone could have done to prevent the tragedy, yet valuable lessons were learned in its aftermath. During World War II, scientists studied the same conditions that had created the Peshtigo firestorm, not to prevent them, but to replicate them as weapons of destruction. Firestorms would later be unleashed during bombing campaigns across Europe and Asia. Peshtigo was rebuilt, though the surrounding forests were so thoroughly burned that the logging industry never recovered. Over time, the population slowly returned, eventually reaching its former size. Today, Peshtigo is a thriving town of about 3,400 residents. Many still call it the city reborn from ashes. Number 2. The 1,900 Big Game Disaster. On November 29, 1900, a massive crowd gathered at Recreation Park in San Francisco to witness the Big Game, the annual college football clash between the California Golden Bears and the Stanford Cardinal. The grandstands were filled to capacity, and hundreds more spectators climbed onto the roof of a nearby factory that overlooked the field, hoping to catch a better view of the much-anticipated match. None of them knew that they were only moments away from witnessing one of the worst sporting disasters in American history. The Big Game had begun in 1892 and was, by 1900, already the oldest rivalry in U.S. college football. The inaugural match was partially organized by Herbert Hoover, Conning, who would later become President of the United States. Conning, but at the time was merely a student manager for Stanford's football and baseball teams. 10,000 tickets had been printed for that first contest, but twice as many fans showed up. Hoover later recalled that cash spilled everywhere because organizers couldn't collect it fast enough, and that they had to scramble to find a football at the last minute because no one had remembered to bring one. The enthusiasm of that first crowd ensured that the Big Game became an annual tradition, its spirit of competition growing fiercer each year. In 1898, a bronze trophy depicting two football players in life-size form was introduced. It was awarded to the University of California after the Golden Bears secured 2 consecutive victories, their first wins in the series. That statue still stands on the Berkeley campus today. By 1900, the big game had become one of the most beloved sporting events in the country. That year's match fell on Thanksgiving Day, November 29th, and tickets sold for $1, the equivalent of about $31 in modern currency. Every seat was quickly sold, but even that couldn't stop determined fans from finding other ways to watch. Recreation Park sat in an industrial area, surrounded by tall buildings. One of them, the San Francisco and Pacific Glass Works, offered an unobstructed view of the field. Hundreds of spectators, many of them children, scaled the factory's steep, pyramid-shaped roof. A long metal ventilator stretched along the ridge of the building, and from there, the entire field could be seen. Roughly 400 people crowded atop that fragile surface, most of them standing directly over the ventilator. The roof was made of thin sheet metal supported by a wooden frame, designed only to bear its own weight. Those standing on it could feel it flex beneath their feet. One survivor later said, "I don't know how many hundreds were up there, but there wasn't an inch of room left to stand." Another recalled, "Everyone was laughing and joking. Someone said, 'If this roof gives way, we're all going down together.'" Inside the factory below, operations were minimal that day. Only one furnace was active, burning at roughly 1,700 degrees Celsius. A small crew of workers was on duty, including a watchman who had been given 6 free tickets in exchange for keeping children off the roof. Despite his best efforts, the crowd was uncontrollable. Children dug holes beneath the fence, and older youths climbed over it. When the watchman waved an iron pipe and ordered them to leave, they simply dodged aside and kept climbing. Concerned, the workers called the police, but were told to report the problem to the officers stationed at the stadium. When they reached the gate, they were denied entry because the park was already at capacity. 20 minutes after kickoff, disaster struck. The overloaded ventilator section on the glass factory roof suddenly gave way, sending roughly 100 people plunging into the building below. It was a horrifying fall, nearly 5 stories, and many victims suffered further injuries when they crashed onto or near the furnace. Its outer surface was hot enough to cause instant third-degree burns. The impact of bodies hitting the machinery ruptured fuel lines, spewing burning oil and igniting new fires. The intense heat made rescue efforts almost impossible. The furnace was surrounded by a metal frame that trapped many of the fallen inside. Factory workers were the first to respond, hastily shutting down the furnace and using any tools they could find to pry victims free from the searing wreckage. Emergency responders soon arrived, but the magnitude of the catastrophe overwhelmed them. One firefighter later recalled, "It was a ghastly sight. We didn't know which way to turn or who to help first. There weren't enough ambulances, so victims were carried away in private wagons, horse carts, and even by hand." Inside the stadium, the football game halted briefly when the roof collapsed. Some in the stands heard the commotion but couldn't see what had happened. After a few moments of confusion, the crowd began to chant, "It's a job!" believing it was a prank by rival fans meant to disrupt the game. Play soon resumed. By the time bodies were being carried out of the factory, Stanford had been declared the winner following a late-game field goal. A parade of celebrations swept through the city, though the festive mood quickly dimmed as news of the disaster spread. Relatives rushed to hospitals, desperately searching for loved ones. Many of the victims were children and young adults. The youngest killed was only 9 years old. Most had climbed the roof because they couldn't afford a ticket and saw it as the only way to watch the game. In total, 23 people were killed, some dying instantly from the fall, others succumbing later to their injuries. One severely burned survivor endured 3 years of operations and amputations before finally passing away. Over 100 more were injured, making it front-page news across the country. Yet, astonishingly, the match results shared equal prominence in the same newspapers. Both student papers, the Stanford Daily and the Daily Californian, covered the game in detail but made no mention of the tragedy that had overshadowed it. A coroner's inquest was convened to determine responsibility. Although the police and factory staff were criticized, the final verdict placed blame on the victims themselves. The report stated, "Those who perished had no lawful reason to be there. No one else can be held accountable for their deaths." Because survivors were legally deemed responsible for their own injuries, none received compensation, no matter how grievous their wounds. The big game continued as an annual tradition, alternating between the two universities. Over the decades, the rivalry flourished, developing beloved customs such as the pre-game bonfire rally. To this day, crowds still gather to cheer when the big game kicks off, and every victory or defeat is meticulously recorded by both schools. Yet the tragedy of 1900 remains the deadliest sporting disaster in American history, and one that time has almost entirely erased from public memory. The legend of the big game endures, but the story of the big game disaster has long since faded into silence. Number 3. The DuPont Plaza Hotel Fire. On December 31st, 1986, guests playing cards in the casino of the DuPont Plaza Hotel in San Juan, Puerto Rico, noticed a faint haze of smoke hanging in the air. Rumors of a fire in the kitchen swept through the room. Some players kept going as if nothing were wrong. Others, uneasy, raked in their chips and began moving toward the nearest exits. They had no idea the room they were standing in was about to be swallowed by the second deadliest hotel fire in United States history. San Juan then, as now, was a premier destination, famed for its tropical climate, lavish restaurants, and vibrant nightlife. Along the Condado waterfront, prestigious hotels offered comfort, luxury, and sweeping ocean views. Among them in 1986 stood the DuPont Plaza. The property had originally opened in 1963 as the Puerto Rico Sheraton, boasting a casino, 2 ballrooms, a swimming pool and outdoor bar, lounges and a nightclub, a rooftop restaurant, and a 2-story penthouse entertainment complex. It also had 423 guest rooms in a 17-story tower. While the hotel promised guests an excellent experience, life was far less smooth for employees. A prolonged dispute had simmered between workers and management. Of the hotel's 450 employees, 250 were members of the local chapter of a major union, TCO, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The two sides clashed repeatedly over wages and contract terms. As 1986 drew to a close, tensions remained high. Frustrated, the union voted to strike beginning at 12:01 a.m. on January 1, 1987, AT, a moment chosen to inflict maximum pressure, coinciding with the hotel's New Year's Eve penthouse party. On the afternoon of December 31st, a final meeting between management and the union failed to avert the walkout. 3 union members, Hector Aponte, 35, maintenance, Jose Lopez, 40, bartend, and Armando Rivera, 29, waiter, were particularly angered by the impasse. Before leaving, they decided to act on their own. They may have been influenced by prior incidents. Since the dispute began, several small, apparently intentional fires had been set at the hotel. Those had been caught and extinguished in time but still disrupted hotel operations. The 3 men chose to set a fire to send a message to management. They went to a ground-floor storage room adjacent to the South Ballroom. There, they placed a can of gel fuel, Sterno-type food-warming fuel, beneath several pieces of furniture still wrapped in cardboard cartons. They lit it, and within seconds the flames spread through the stacked goods and into the ballroom's partitions. All 3 fled. In moments, the blaze was out of control. Staff noticed smoke but did not know what to do. Most had never been trained in fire safety. One guard ran upstairs in search of a supervisor, while another tried to call for help only to find the phones were not working. The fire raced through the lower levels. Survivors later said everything changed with startling speed. At first, there was only a light haze, seemingly harmless, so only a few people left. Within minutes, that faint veil became a roiling black ceiling of smoke that dropped lower and lower, sending crowds into panic as they scrambled for exits. About 150 guests were in the casino, Iha Manai, which was busier than usual because it was slated to close early that night. As they tried to escape, some found doors had been locked by management to deter theft. A few pushed toward the rare unlocked doors, unaware they opened inward only. As the smoke layer sank to head level, people smashed windows with chairs and jumped, often suffering severe injuries, but making the only right choice. Just minutes after the fire began, a flashover swept the casino, a wall of flame that instantly killed everyone still inside. Elsewhere in the hotel, many people still had no idea a fire was raging. The tower's fire alarm system was not functioning. Some guests learned what was happening by smelling smoke, receiving phone warnings from the front desk, or seeing fire engines massing outside. Those who attempted to flee found hallways and stairwells choked with smoke. Some wrapped wet towels around their faces and felt their way along. Others were driven back into rooms and out onto balconies. From there, they improvised, climbing onto exterior wooden structures or scrambling up to higher balconies to avoid the toxic plume. A few on the balconies considered jumping, but firefighters on loudspeakers pleaded with them to stay calm, remain in place, and await rescue. Guests on higher floors could make their way to the rooftop restaurant. There, they broke windows and climbed onto the exterior framing to reach the highest portion of the roof, where helicopters could land and ferry them to safety. People in that area quickly organized. Volunteers stayed at higher levels to guide late-arriving guests up to the roof. The first rescue helicopter was not a fire department aircraft at all, King First. It belonged to a private pilot who happened to be flying by and spotted the column of smoke. Despite the danger, he began shuttling trapped guests away from the blaze until National Guard and U.S. Coast Guard helicopters arrived. Official responders reached the scene roughly 10 minutes after the first calls for help. Fire crews dragged hose lines into a building thick with smoke, while injured staff and guests were carried on lounge chairs to the pool deck for treatment. Those sheltering on balconies were rescued by ladders and ropes, or escorted through smoke-filled stairwells by firefighters with breathing apparatus. Rescue operations continued into late evening, when the main body of fire was finally knocked down. In all, 97 people died. The vast majority, at least 84, were found in the casino, and most succumbed to burns rather than smoke inhalation. Among the survivors, 146 were injured, many with life-altering harm. The National Fire Protection Association's investigation concluded that multiple factors magnified the catastrophe: an inoperative tower alarm system, untrained staff, sprinklers installed only in the laundry, and exits in the casino that were both locked and non-compliant. The 3 hotel employees who set the fire were swiftly arrested and charged with arson and murder. Investigators determined their intent was to pressure management into conceding to the union, not to kill. The union denied any prior knowledge and maintained the men acted alone. Hector Aponte, RST, the man who lit the fire, received 2 concurrent 99-year sentences. Armando Rivera, who supplied the fuel, was sentenced to 75 years. Jose Lopez, CA, who urged the others to set the blaze, received 99 years in prison. The case spurred a comprehensive federal review of local and regional fire safety laws. Just 3 years after the DuPont Plaza tragedy, the Hotel and Motel Fire Safety Act was enacted, requiring all hotels and government buildings to install smoke detectors in every guest room and automatic sprinklers in buildings more than 3 stories tall. The DuPont Plaza closed for 6 years, changed ownership, and underwent a full renovation costing $130 million. In February 1995, it officially reopened as the San Juan Marriott Resort and Stellaris Casino. Today, guests can take comfort in the Marriott Group's leadership in fire safety standards worldwide. Its in-house fire protection engineering teams consult on hotel design and renovation, and the company partners with research institutes on scientific fire safety projects. Efforts that, one hopes, will ensure this remains one of the worst hotel fires America has ever witnessed, never to be repeated. Number 4. The Harrow and Wealdstone Rail Crash. On the morning of October 8, 1952, hundreds of commuters crowded aboard a local train bound for London at Harrow and Wealdstone Station. It was a foggy morning, and the British railway network was in disarray, with several trains delayed. Most passengers were preoccupied with finding a seat in the packed carriages or worrying about being late for work. None of them knew they were about to become victims of the worst peacetime rail disaster in British history. Harrow and Wealdstone Station, originally built in 1837, had once been a quiet rural stop far from central London. As the city expanded, the station grew with it, rebuilt and enlarged over the decades, eventually linking both the underground and mainline services. By the 1950s, London's reach had turned Harrow and Wealdstone into a bustling suburban hub, serving not only daily commuters but also long-distance travelers on the West Coast Main Line, a route connecting the capital to northern cities as far as Perth, Scotland. That morning's rush hour, October 8, 1952, was unusually chaotic. A central London service had been cancelled due to maintenance work, setting off a chain of severe delays. The heavy industrial smog made things worse. In the 1950s, thick morning fog mixed with factory emissions to create a choking haze known as pea soup, the result of an era before Britain's Clean Air Act. Amid that tense morning, driver R.S. Jones began his shift aboard the overnight train from Perth to Euston, which had departed crew earlier that morning. Though much of the network had been electrified, a few steam locomotives were still in service. ISU-2, this was one of them. The train consisted of 11 coaches hauled by a powerful LMS Coronation-class engine named City of Glasgow. Jones was a veteran engineer with years of experience on the Crewe Euston line and an unblemished safety record. He had passed his medical exams with ease and possessed perfect eyesight. With Jones at the controls, the train made its steady approach toward London. Many passengers were waking after the night journey, while others, including a group of soldiers, remained awake, chatting and singing softly. At 8:17 a.m., as the train neared Harrow and Wealdstone, it was supposed to halt for a few minutes at a red signal outside the station, but on that morning, it did not slow down. The train ran through the caution signal, then the danger signal, and hurtled straight into the station. The emergency brakes were applied, there, but far too late. The overnight express from Perth plowed directly into a local commuter train that had been standing on platform 4. The local train, made up of 9 carriages and carrying more than 800 people, was packed, every seat taken, passengers crammed in corridors and doorways. The collision was catastrophic. The last 3 coaches of the local train were crushed beyond recognition. The entire consist shoved violently forward. The City of Glasgow engine reared up and rode over the rear of the local train before coming to rest. Less than a minute later, another train was approaching Harrow and Wealdstone, a 15-car express bound for Liverpool, hauled by 2 heavy steam locomotives, Windward Islands and Princess Anne. Its driver believed the track ahead was clear and maintained high speed. In an instant, the express slammed into the wreckage, derailing spectacularly. Both locomotives, NS, each weighing dozens of tons, slid across the platform and crashed into the crowd of dazed survivors who had only just escaped the first impact. The explosions and grinding of metal were so deafening that station staff called for rescue services immediately, without even seeing what had happened. Survivor Pelham B. Swan later recalled, "Suddenly there was a tremendous crash. The carriage shook. The windows burst, and fragments of glass flew everywhere. There were 8 more violent jolts, probably the coaches behind piling up. No one screamed or panicked. We were too stunned to grasp what had happened. I forced the door open, and everyone poured out. The station was chaos. The carriages were crumpled and stacked like jagged teeth. A dreadful, heartbreaking scene. Even the footbridge had collapsed. Despite the enormous loss of life, the tragedy could have been far worse if not for the rapid response of rescue workers. NAU.S. Air Force medical unit that happened to be nearby. The unit arrived within an hour, led by Lieutenant Abby Sweetwine, whom newspapers later dubbed the Angel of Platform 6. She used whatever she could find to save lives, marking an X in lipstick on the foreheads of those who had been treated, and an M for those who had been given morphine to prevent accidental overdoses. Blankets were torn into makeshift bandages. Firefighters, police, and medics worked side by side to extract survivors, cordon off the site, and search for the missing. They were joined by volunteers and civilians, among them 14-year-old Gilbert Powell. Waiting for his school bus outside the station when he heard the crash, he sprinted in to help. His small size allowed him to crawl into spaces too tight for adults, pulling out trapped passengers. For 4 hours he worked tirelessly, applying first aid techniques learned in the Boy Scouts, then later asked a nurse for a note to excuse his absence from school. 12. For a good reason. A total of 112 people were killed that morning. Around 340 were injured, with 157 requiring hospitalization. Some escaped by pure chance, a man who had left his seat to shave at the wash basin when the collision occurred, another who switched cars moments before impact. Tiny decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The Ministry of Transport launched a full inquiry, releasing its findings in June 1953. Investigators found no mechanical failure and no error by signal operators. The report concluded that restricted visibility from the dense fog, combined with confusion or inattention on the part of the Perth train's driver, was the most likely cause of the initial crash. Tragically, Jones himself had perished, making it impossible to determine the exact reason. The report also highlighted differences between carriage types. All-steel coaches withstood impact far better than older wooden ones, a finding that accelerated Britain's transition to all-steel rolling stock. In summary, the ministry attributed the disaster primarily to human error, emphasizing the critical importance of strict signal adherence. However, it also noted the promise of a new safety measure then under development, AWS, the Automatic Warning System, AWS, a device that alerted drivers when approaching caution or danger signals and automatically applied the brakes if they failed to respond. In terms of casualties, the Harrow and Wealdstone disaster of 1952 remains Britain's second deadliest rail accident, surpassed only by the Quintonhill crash during World War I. The AWS system was gradually implemented on British railways in the years that followed, and by the late 1970s, it covered nearly one-third of the national rail network. For decades, survivors and local residents campaigned for a permanent memorial. In 2002, on the 50th anniversary of the tragedy, a solemn ceremony was held, and officials unveiled a stone monument near the station entrance, where it still stands today. Number 5. On March 15, 1986, the New World Hotel in Singapore suddenly collapsed in its entirety. The catastrophe triggered a large-scale rescue operation that lasted 4 days and mobilized more than 500 responders. It was one of the most serious disasters Singapore had faced since the end of World War II, and it led to sweeping, nationwide changes in building safety standards. The 1960s were a period of upheaval for Singapore. In 1963, after 144 years as a British colony, Singapore became a state within the Federation of Malaysia. Just 2 years later, it left Malaysia and declared full independence. The era also marked a powerful economic surge. From 1965 to 1970, Singapore's gross domestic product doubled. Thousands of new businesses were founded and flourished in the newly independent nation. At the same time, the government promoted Singapore abroad to attract tourists, running advertising campaigns in the United States, Australia, and Japan with striking success. Between 1970 and 1977, tourist arrivals to Singapore tripled. It was during this boom that the New World Hotel was planned and built, a 6-story structure originally known as the New Serangoon Hotel. In 1984, it was renamed the Hotel New World. Despite its name, the building housed more than guest rooms. The ground floor served as a branch of a commercial bank, while the second floor contained the Universal Neptune nightclub and restaurant. A basement level was designed as an underground car park, and the roof carried heavy plant equipment, water tanks, boilers, cooling towers, and the condensers for the air conditioning system. Business at the New World Hotel was generally steady, though 1975 had been a difficult year. That August, a carbon monoxide leak sent 35 guests to the hospital, 9/6, fortunately with no fatalities or severe injuries. From that incident until the building's collapse in 1986, there were no reports of structural concerns. Staff and guests went about their lives, unaware of the danger lurking within the building itself. In the days before March 15th, cracks began to appear in the columns, walls, and floors. Some people were alarmed, but their fears were soothed when workers arrived to patch the fissures. None of them knew those cracks were far more than cosmetic. In fact, several primary columns had already been compromised, forcing the building's load onto the remaining supports. For 2 days, occupants heard loud cracking sounds and saw new fractures forming, along with debris falling from the basement car park ceiling. One passerby later said he felt what seemed like a minor tremor as he walked past the building. At 11:25 a.m., on March 15th, the New World Hotel collapsed completely. The entire sequence took only seconds. Within that brief moment, a 6-story structure became a vast pile of rubble, with not a single wall or column left standing. At the time of the collapse, about 50 people were inside. Survivors were trapped beneath layers of concrete and brick. Within minutes, the first 2 fire engines arrived. Local residents immediately clambered onto the debris to dig for survivors, and within half an hour they were joined by large contingents from the Singapore Civil Defence Force, SCDF, and medics from the Singapore Armed Forces. The rescue effort began at once, and several early saves were made. A tourist who had been on an upper floor was pulled out within hours. Another employee was rescued with minor injuries. But reaching those buried deeper in the concrete became extraordinarily difficult. Heavy machinery, cranes and excavators, was brought in to remove debris, but using it risked shifting the rubble and crushing anyone still alive underneath. At the time, many international engineers were in Singapore overseeing construction of the Mass Rapid Transit (MRT) system. A group of those engineers warned that heavy equipment was too dangerous. They volunteered to join the rescue by hand tunneling through the debris to reach survivors and by repurposing existing underground ventilation ducts to speed access. It was perilous work. Teams used vibration-sensing life detectors to locate movement beneath the wreckage. As they passed through what had been the basement car park, they found numerous crushed cars leaking large amounts of gasoline into the rubble. One spark could have meant a deadly explosion. Despite the hazards, engineers and rescuers pressed on, inching toward likely survival voids. They used high-pressure water jets to cut through shattered concrete and hydraulic jacks to shore the debris overhead. Even with extreme care, they were forced to abandon their first tunnel after a near cave-in and start anew. Undeterred, teams opened additional tunnels, eventually breaking through to several pockets where survivors remained. The work stretched on for days, with many rescuers laboring around the clock to reach the injured in time. By March 19th, the main rescue operation ended. Over 4 days, everyone who had been inside the building was accounted for. 17 people were pulled alive from the ruins. 33 bodies were recovered. A week after the disaster, President Wee Kim Wee established a commission of inquiry. The report, which took nearly a year to complete, delivered troubling findings. Because the collapse was so sudden, some initially suspected a bomb. But after engineers examined the site, they found no evidence of an explosion, and the theory was dismissed. Concrete samples from the building were laboratory tested and met international safety standards. The possibility of substandard materials was rejected, as was the notion of flawed foundations or problematic local geology. Only when investigators reviewed the original structural design did the true cause emerge. They discovered that the 2 individuals who drafted the structural drawings lacked the proper expertise, URT, and had made a fatal computational error. The design accounted for live loads, a weight of occupants, furnishings, and equipment during use. However, it omitted the dead load, the weight of the building itself. By failing to include it, the designers gravely underestimated the forces the columns had to bear. As a result, many of the building's columns were almost overloaded from the day of completion. Over the years, additional weight, ST, from new air conditioning equipment, exterior cladding, and the bank's reinforced vault on the ground floor pushed those already weak columns beyond their capacity. That is why cracks appeared in the days before the disaster, and why the New World Hotel ultimately suffered a total collapse. Following the inquiry, the Singapore government issued new regulations requiring that all structural designs, AAG public and private, undergo independent peer review by qualified professionals. Buildings from the same era were audited. A few were deemed unsafe and were immediately evacuated, demolished, and rebuilt. The site of the former hotel was cleared, and by 1994, a new building, the Fortuna Hotel, Lock, was opened there. The SCDF and other rescue units received increased funding for equipment and training to ensure that any similar disaster could be handled more effectively and safely. Families of those who died received 24,000 Singapore dollars each, and a relief fund totaling more than $900,000 was established to support victims' children. The volunteers who risked their lives tunneling through the rubble to save survivors were formally honored by the Singapore government and awarded medals for bravery. The collapse of the Hotel New World spurred rapid, far-reaching reforms in Singapore's building policies. Though those changes cannot bring back the 33 lives lost, they have significantly reduced the risk that such a tragedy will ever occur again. Number 6. The Empress of Ireland. On May 29, 1914, 2 great passenger ships collided in dense fog at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River off Canada's eastern shore. The impact claimed more than 1,000 lives aboard RMS Empress of Ireland, AMD, a death toll comparable to the RMS Titanic disaster 2 years earlier. It remains the 4th deadliest peacetime maritime tragedy on record. From the mid-19th century to the early 20th, ocean travel entered a golden age. Shipbuilding technology advanced rapidly, and demand for new vessels surged, driven by global trade, waves of migration, and later the outbreak of World War I. Commercial lines expanded their fleets. Canadian Pacific steamships was among the largest, carrying passengers between the United Kingdom and Canada. the company commissioned the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company at Govan, Scotland, to construct a new liner, the Empress of Ireland. Work began in April 1905, and the ship was launched in January 1906. Built of steel, the Empress measured 174 meters in length, with 4 expansive decks divided into passenger accommodations and public rooms. Power came from twin screws driven by 4-cylinder, quadruple expansion steam engines, giving a service speed of 18 knots and a westbound Atlantic crossing in under 4 days. For safety, the hull was subdivided into 11 watertight compartments, sealable by 24 steel flooding doors. After the Titanic tragedy in 1912, international lifeboat regulations were revised, and the Empress of Ireland replaced her wooden boats with sturdier steel lifeboats. Her total capacity was 1,542 passengers, 310 in first class, on the promenade decks near the dining saloon, library, and an elegant, glass-domed music room complete with a grand piano. 468 in second class on the main and lower promenade decks. 764 in third class OPS, mostly immigrants, forward in the ship. Across 8 years of service, the Empress of Ireland served Canada's Irish community, carrying travelers between Liverpool, Ireland, and Canadian ports. Seasonally, she used different termini: Quebec in late spring, summer, and fall, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and St. John, New Brunswick, in winter and early spring. On the afternoon of May 28, 1914, the Empress of Ireland departed Quebec on what would be her final voyage to Liverpool. Captain Henry George Kendall, recently promoted that month, commanded the ship. Aboard were 420 crew and 1,057 passengers, many of them members of the Salvation Army en route to the Third International Congress in London, along with North Americans and Canadians returning to visit family in Europe. By the following morning, the liner reached Pointe-au-Père, where the river pilot who had guided her through the Narrows disembarked. The Empress then stood downriver toward open sea. Around midnight, visibility was still clear, and the watch could easily make out traffic ahead. One such vessel was the Norwegian collier SS Storstad, steaming westward. While the air remained clear, the two ships faced no danger of collision. Then a sudden bank of thick fog rolled over the river mouth, cutting visibility to nearly zero. Both vessels sounded their fog signals to indicate position, but to no avail. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, the Storstad loomed out of the murk and rammed directly into the Empress's starboard side. The damage was catastrophic. A gaping rent opened below the waterline, and flooding surged into the lower compartments, where most second and third class passengers slept. For a brief time, the ships held fast together, and Captain Kendall realized the Empress would sink at once unless something changed. He hailed the Storstad, ordering her to keep her engines on and press ahead, hoping the Norwegian ship's bow would plug the hole in the Empress's side. Despite Kendall's attempt to have the collier hold position as a makeshift patch, the powerful thrust of both vessels, combined with the swift St. Lawrence current, quickly tore them apart. Once the starboard breach was fully exposed, the Empress of Ireland's fate was sealed. Water poured through the ragged opening at a terrifying rate, leaving no time to close the watertight doors. The ship heeled rapidly to starboard, letting water rush in through open portholes that passengers had left ajar for ventilation. Those in the lower spaces, crew and second and third class travelers, had almost no chance to escape and were among the first victims. On the upper decks, there was a brief opportunity to launch lifeboats, but the steep list meant many boats smashed against the ship's side, pitching people into the frigid water. Within minutes, the electrical systems failed, plunging the liner into total darkness. As the starboard list increased, hundreds scrambled onto the port side seeking a way out, but hope was fading. In less than 15 minutes after the impact, the Empress of Ireland capsized completely and sank. The loss of life was staggering. Records were incomplete, making exact figures uncertain, but most accounts agree that at least 1,014 people died when the Empress of Ireland went down. The Storstad quickly began recovering survivors from the water, lowering her own lifeboats to haul people aboard. 2 other ships, Eureka and Lady Evelyn, were alerted by the Pointe-au-Père life-saving station after receiving the distress call. Eureka arrived at 3:10 a.m., rescuing roughly 150 people, UK, some plucked directly from the river, others taken from a few of the Empress's lifeboats that remained afloat. Survivors were taken ashore at the Rimouski Pier for first aid and urgent medical care. When Lady Evelyn reached the scene, no one was left alive in the water, but she helped land the 200 survivors picked up by the Storstad and also recovered 133 bodies. Captain Kendall was among the fortunate to survive. Thrown from the bridge as his ship began to founder, he was pulled into a lifeboat by his crew. He and his men rowed repeatedly between the Empress and the Storstad to save others, until the cold overwhelmed further efforts. Among the dead were Lawrence Irving, son of famed English stage actor Sir Henry Irving, and Irving's wife, Sir Henry Seton Carr, a former member of Parliament, and Gabriel J. Marks, the mayor of Suva. In second class, 167 members of the Salvation Army perished beneath the river. An 11-day inquiry convened at Quebec under Lord Mersey, the same jurist who had served in the Titanic investigation. The court examined key questions. Did the crews act competently and follow proper procedures? How did visibility change as the fog descended? Were foghorn signals used correctly to indicate course? And most crucially, who bore responsibility? Captain Kendall or the Storstad's officers? The inquiry confirmed that whistle and light signals had been used according to regulations, and while the ships could still see one another, both were on safe courses to avoid collision. But once the fog set in, the Storstad altered to starboard at the last moment, producing the fatal strike. Afterward, the court ordered the Storstad's owners to pay 2 million Canadian dollars in damages, chiefly for the loss of silver bullion carried aboard the Empress of Ireland. Because the wreck lay in relatively shallow water, salvage was deemed feasible, and divers later recovered safes, valuables, mail, and some remains from the hull. The sinking of the Empress of Ireland ranks among history's worst maritime calamities, with more than 1,000 lives lost. Yet it never drew the same press attention as the Titanic in 1912, perhaps because it occurred on the eve of World War I, when the world's focus quickly shifted elsewhere. The tragedy spurred changes in ship design. The Storstad's bow projected deep below the waterline, concentrating collision damage under the surface, a factor that hastened the Empress's sinking. Subsequent vessels were designed with higher, more flared bows so that, in a collision, energy and damage would be borne by the above-water structure, where it could be more readily contained. Today, the wreck of the Empress of Ireland rests on the floor of the street, Lawrence between Rimouski and Pointe-au-Père, its memory preserved by monuments on shore, solemn witnesses to the more than 1,000 souls who were lost to the river on May 29, 1914. And that is the story for today. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you receive a notification each time we release a new one. Time we release a new one. Time we release a new one. Time we release a new one.